Hi, my name is Molly, and I am a patient of Dr. Joe here at Copacetic Health Institute. And we're here on a Saturday, and we're just having such a great discussion with something that I am presently experiencing that you have witnessed in many of your patients in regards to progress. And I'll let you pick this up, but I think it was just such an important perspective that many people can benefit from. So here we are with this recording. So, Joe, if you could pick us up and give us the background in terms of, with the patient's progress and treatment can only get us so far. And then we started to have this great discussion regarding the final 20%.
So in chronic long-term cases, this is what I've observed. And I've worked with a lot of these in my practice over the years. Getting to 80% improvement is fairly linear. It might be a little bit bumpy at first as we're figuring things out, as we're aligning, chemistry, or maybe making some dietary changes or figuring out just the way the body's going to be responsive to treatment. That 80% fairly linear. When you have the individual, and I love working with these individuals, when you have the individual that wants to get to 100%, even if they've had something their whole life and their nervous system and their mind really has no reference for what it actually means to be healthy, to have the absence of suffering, right? Where everything is functioning well and everything feels fluid and you feel a sense of freedom in your body. There's no reference point for a lot of people, especially people who have these chronic conditions. In chronic conditions, oftentimes they don't really fit into a box, which in my experience, almost no condition actually fits into a diagnostic box. They're forced into a diagnostic box, but that's another conversation for another time. So that final 20% is very unpredictable and often takes longer to achieve than the initial 80%. And again, this is what I've observed. So from my perspective, the nervous system really represents what is often referred to as our subconscious. So unless we were born into an idealistic environment, which I don't know anybody who actually was, then what's triggered, maybe in the birthing process itself or just after being born, is the innate threat response within the nervous system. That threat response is an expression of the desire to feel safe. And if the needs aren't met, then that threat response develops a neuroplasticity, in meaning that it's like imagine that it's like a music or a tune that the nervous system plays over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until it becomes that person's reality. Now, imagine that the nervous system is kind of like a stringed instrument, and what happens with that threat response is a gripping, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt gripping starts to take place. And then when that gripping is reinforced over time, some people might call it like armoring. It's reinforced over time. It's gripping. That triggers, for instance, the tendons to grip. And
I literally feel my stomach and my gripping in between like both sides of like my vagus nerve is just like.
So I would say just in general, I've seen in women, typically it's those two areas. And in men, it's the lower back and the hips. In both men and women, it's the shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but gripping. In terms of the abdomen, digestive tract, that is going to impede what's called vagal tone. So and the ability of the brain to communicate with the digestive tract and the enteric nervous system. So that more often than not leads to these sort of unexplained digestive disorders that often might actually be either on the cusp of autoimmune or really become autoimmune. Autoimmune meaning that it pulls in the immune system, which is also an expression of our threat response, and the immune system loses the ability to differentiate itself from other. So,
directly the threat response.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's multi layers to the threat response, but that's the sort of ingrained over time sort of basic threat response. The nervous system threat response of tightening things, that's actually preparing the body for either a physical confrontation or preparing the body to tighten so it's faster as it's fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
Even for a newborn. Most folks, and myself included, identify who and what they are in their personality traits with actually that threat response pattern. Because that threat response pattern is really your way of interacting with the world and your way of interacting with yourself, which is also another discussion because that doesn't make much sense. How do you interact with yourself if you're a subject? But
yeah,
maybe we'll get to that in this. So most personality traits are this. It's how do I manipulate the world? Do I do it through kindness or agreeableness, right? Do I do it through force? Do I do it to try and force people to behave how I want them to behave so I don't feel threatened, right? Because deep down there's this knot of insecurity, right? And that knot of insecurity is the reality then in which this Doppler effect of physiology, chemistry, and then behavior kind of goes out from. So the original architecture, the original way in which everything works together as a gestalt, as a whole, that's overridden by this threat response, because if you can't feel safe, then nothing else matters, okay? So in the process of untying the knots that are these complex conditions, the nervous system has to change the way it's firing, has to move out of threat response, and has to, in turn, be able to communicate with the brain so that proper function returns, right? An intervention that tries to force the body to heal doesn't help the body heal.
Say that again.
An intervention whose goal is to force the body to heal does not help the body heal. Okay, instead what it does is it performs a particular function. It forces that function. Well, if we're talking about the underlying issue is a threat response and there's a force coming in, forcing something, what do you think that reinforces?
Yeah, the broken foundation and condition.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right? So really what we have to do is get the nervous system comfortable over time, get the chemistry better aligned, give it the resources it needs to do what it needs to do, and slowly but surely you can get to that 80%. So things are functioning 80% better. The person has 80% less stress. Their emotions regulate, their digestion regulates, their sleep regulates, 80% better. I would say most people stop there.
Yeah.
Okay? Because even that, they're like, whoa.
It's great.
This is great.
Yeah.
But for the folks that have these sort of complex cases that really there's a depth of suffering there, what happens is that we get to the 80% and they want to push beyond that 80%. And typically what occurs when you push past that 8% is that the nervous system pushes back. And when it pushes back, there's a regression.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting, and there's a patient I love dearly, older gentleman, has had alkalizing spondylosis for 50 years, better part of 50 years, had 10 out of 10 pain. And if you understand alkalizing spondylosis, you believe them. Like people who say they have 10 out of 10, I don't believe them, because if you had 10 out of 10 pain, you would be screaming while you're talking to me.
Right.
But what this fellow did was he adapted to the pain over time. So he was able, he willed himself to be in the world and be in the state of pain at the same time. I mean, that takes an enormous will, and I have so much respect for him. Anyway, so he had 10 out of 10. He was so intent that he said he was going to come 3 times a week until the situation was resolved. Now, he said this being at first a skeptic. He didn't believe it would work. But when he saw that it was working, he saw the progressive nature of it, he said, I'm going to do this. And he didn't put a time cap on it. So now we've been working together for, I think, about 10 months. At about the 8-month mark, his pain consistently was between a 0 and a 1, or 0.5 and a 1.
It's huge from a 10 to
From a 10. Okay? Now, what he started to be aware of were there were structural issues that developed over time from the tensing, right? So then we decided to start working on the structural issues, right? So that's unpacking something right there. Okay, so we'll unpack that. He also wanted to get off of the pharma that he was on for the pain, which was an injection that he took roughly every 3.5 weeks. So he just decided, listen, I'm going to not do the injection. I said, well, that's your prerogative. I can't tell you what to do. I can work with you in the process, but when it comes to pharmaceuticals, that's between you and your MD. He said, well, this is what I'm going to do. Okay. So we're at 5 weeks, we're at 6 weeks, we're at 7 weeks. Every time he comes in, still haven't taken it. Pain is still at 0.5 to 1. He was getting enthusiastic. Now, the pharmaceutical interventions over time had triggered an inability for his cells to regulate blood sugar, so he developed diabetes. And I trust his story on this. He started new pharma within a week. So clearly there was a underlying tendency there, but it got triggered.
So he started the new pharma and he felt better, you're saying, previously?
No, so he would cycle through different pharmas throughout the history of him dealing with this condition. And one of those new pharmas that he took triggered diabetes. Okay. So this was in his past. So he was also on an injectable for the type 2 diabetes.
So injectable for pain, which he's now off, and then he was on an injectable for diabetes.
Well, I wouldn't say he's entirely off, but he's pushing it off.
Sure.
Now, he decided on his own, even though it's, you gotta communicate with folks, to not do the injectable for the diabetes. So now we're at 4 weeks for that, we're at 5 weeks for that. Around 5 weeks of that. And bear in mind, we're taking botanicals to help regulate the blood sugar. He's made dietary changes, and actually his blood sugar is actually 30 points. That's how high it was. 30 points lower than it was when he was on the pharmaceutical. But he's still not taking the pharmaceutical. And remember, everything that you put in on your body is going to affect its patterns, right? And it likes what's familiar. The nervous system likes what's familiar, right? Good is arbitrary, but good for most people is what's familiar, because that's what's comfortable.
Sure.
Same thing with the nervous system. So we're at 5 weeks, and all of a sudden he comes in, He had been at a baseball game the day before. He had his head turned in the same direction for the whole game, and it locked up. And he came in and he said his pain was back in full. I said, "Are you sure your pain is back in full?" "Yeah, it's back in full." I said, "Because what I've observed over time is if somebody has pain, let's say, just for the sake of argument, 10 out of 10, and we drop it down to 0.5 to 1, and then it bumps back up to 5, it feels like 10.
Sure.
So after a conversation, that's actually what it was. And that's what it is for most people. So just like he adapted to the 10 out of 10, the absence of it brought this ease, this joy. Like everyone thought that he was this curmudgeon, and then he became this joyful guy, right? And then the pain came back, not in full. I would say, venture to say, based upon just viewing the way he moves his body, like he couldn't turn on the treatment table. He has no problem getting up on the treatment table right now in the state of pain that he's in. So I don't even know if it's a 5 really, maybe it's a 4. But when it comes back even a little bit, it's really gut-wrenching because you've felt free, and now that freedom is taken away.
There's a despair.
And there's a despair that can settle in, absolutely. But this is not unusual. You're experiencing it now in your process. 80%, that's safe. You want 100%. You want to fly to the sun. You know, your wings might melt. So then how do you get that extra 20%? In my experience, and early on in my career, I worked a lot with addicts. It was an amazing learning experience. I learned how to I think see people better, because addicts can be very, very charming. They charm themselves and really see what's going on. And what I found with addicts is that the only thing that really worked was what we did worked, but they needed to concurrently also be in a 12-step program, or something like a 12-step program. So in the two main things that I identified were the second step in the 12-step program, which is you came to believe that your life would become unmanageable. You're in a state of suffering, and you've tried and tried and tried and tried and tried to get out of the state of suffering, and you can't. Well, that means that you don't have the ability to actually manage that situation. That's what it means. It's very clear. So you came to believe that your life would become unmanageable. Step 2. Step 3, you profess to turn your life and will over to the care of God. Right? What does God mean? God means I don't have the wherewithal to get myself to the place I know I need to go. But I have to have faith in something. I need to have faith that that place exists. And I have to turn over my will, my sense of control, to that thing. Because the sense of control is actually keeping the same firing happen between the brain and the body and the nervous system. Right? It's like, oh, I'm thinking about this differently. I'm thinking about this differently. Why aren't I changing? Well, you're not changing because that thinking is also an expression of control. So the faith aspect is what gets you in that to make that sort of quantum leap into actually feeling safe. So if you turn over your life and will to the care of God, that God needs to be omnipresent, omnipotent, and benevolent. Its intent of goodness needs to be greater than your intent. And you have to give your allegiance to that.
And you were saying too, it doesn't have to necessarily be God.
No, it's whatever you can. So, there was this wonderful theologian in the 20th century. His name was Paul Tillich, and he wrote a small book called The Courage to Be.
Mm-hmm.
And the conclusion of that book was, you have to have an ultimate concern. It almost ties into some degree with the idea of Arjun in the Bhagavad Gita, who's an archer. So you're the bow, essentially, and your life is the arrow. Well, you have to have a target,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can't be both the bow and the target. So what's the target? The target has to be the highest good, right? But here's the crux. If you're thinking from the threat response mind, the highest good is not going to be the highest good. The threat response mind, for the threat response mind, is going to be about accumulation of essentially wealth and power will be the highest good. But at the end of the day, and trust me, I've worked with, especially in my practice in Los Angeles, extraordinarily wealthy people who, quite honestly, in general, not in every case, but in general, were the most unhappy people that I worked with. Okay? Because the aspect of them that wanted those things thought that if they got those things, then they would feel safe.
But the underlying foundational
Insecurity was never addressed.
right.
So I'm not saying that those things are necessarily bad, but if there isn't that faith component,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to transcend the underlying wound. Okay? So, how does acupuncture work with that? Do we just get to 80% and it's like,
You're on your own.
go completely give yourself over to God and it gets there? In my experience, I mean, maybe that's the case, theoretically, certainly, right? But in my experience, what acupuncture does, when a treatment is done well, when the person gets up and walks out of the treatment room, they're in a state where they experience what used to be referred to as a flow state. They have a sense of freedom within themselves and they're present.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have that self-other dialogue in their head, which doesn't make sense anyway, because it's like, oh, I had a conversation with myself. Really, how does that work? Because if you have a conversation with yourself, that means you're both a subject and an object. And that makes no sense whatsoever. That's actually an illusion that we play within ourselves. We turn ourselves into an object and we think we know what our tendencies are, and we think we know, for instance, like how our body is feeling or what it's doing. But the moment we objectify ourselves, there's a disconnect and we can't see clearly because it's not reality. The reality is you're just a subject. You can't be both a subject and an object at the same time. This is why we need people in our lives. People that can actually see us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we can't see ourselves,
Right.
fundamentally. So they're in this flow state where they're present. So they're that gestalt, they're that unit. And there isn't a negative voice going on in their head, creating a threat response, making themselves a bad guy within themselves. So, creating that self versus other within themselves and reinforcing that threat response, right? So they're in that state. And maybe it lasts till they get to their car and start driving because maybe they have an underlying stress response to driving, or maybe they get home, or maybe it lasts for a day or 2 or 3 days or a week or 2 weeks, right? Oftentimes there's some sort of trigger and the gripping happens again. But if you do that consistently, then you develop a neuroplasticity. So the nervous system starts getting used to the absence of the threat response. And the more you get used to the absence of the threat response, the more familiar it becomes, and the more willing the subconscious, which is the intelligence of the nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
is willing then to not resist that state. So what happens when you push for that additional 20%, that retraction is caused by that. So hold on a second. Going to the place of the absence of the threat response is not safe.
Yeah.
I need to grip and pull back. So the last time I saw you, you were on cloud nine, like you were in a state of efficiency, I think, like you would never experience. You had processed all this stuff that you had from your past. You were moving forward. You were able to focus. You were accomplishing. You got a raise. Like, it was all great.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was like 2 weeks later,
Mm-hmm.
you came in here and everything had changed. Like, your body had physically noticeably changed.
Yeah, which creates more despair and reinforces the either the unworthiness or reinforces the previous patterns.
They come back easily, don't
They come back so easy.
It's like if the way you soothed yourself, because you're in threat response all day, which basically means you're not breathing. Okay, so you haven't been breathing all day. Well, how do you soothe yourself? Hypothetically, you eat a pint of ice cream. So you eat a pint of ice cream, let's say 5 nights out of 7 nights a week, and you do that for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And then that has thrown off your chemistry sufficiently and your physiology sufficiently, and there's enough inflammation based on that, and your gut is now thrown off, and now it's not generating enough neurotransmitters, and your mood and your ability to focus is in flux and everything. You're like, I'm going to clean it up. And you come here and we clean it all up. All right? But you go out and you have a hard day, and we all have a hard day. Some weeks more than others. And you're driving home, and you're like, oh, screw this.
I want that ice cream.
I'm getting that ice cream.
I want a treat.
And you go and you buy that pint of ice cream, and you go and you sit on the couch and you disappear into that pint. You just disappear. Guess what happens? Just like an alcoholic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what happens is that the entire cascade of the way your nervous system had been firing, the way your physiology had been functioning, the way your chemistry was aligned, the way you perceived the world, the way you experienced the world, it all comes rushing back really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And you're back in it. It's like climbing a ladder, and you've climbed higher on that ladder than you ever have, and then you fall, and you're back at the bottom again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But what's interesting is that if you're willing to climb every time you fall, each time you climb, typically you climb faster.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because those pathways are there. They're just, the grooves of them aren't as deep.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not the worst thing in the world. And the thing that I say to folks when that happens is, that's okay. If you start shaming yourself over it, you're reinforcing the stress response. You're reinforcing turning yourself into a bad guy. You're reinforcing the self versus other.
It's compounding.
It compounds. It's the Ouroboros. It's the snake eating its own tail, right? So just be okay with it. Now, people are like, well, if I'm okay with it, then I'm going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
No. If you accept that you've done this, it opens the space for you not to do it again, because it's okay. And it's ironic, but when you beat yourself up over something,
Mm-hmm.
you actually reinforce the behavior that you're shaming yourself on. It's a negative reinforcement, right? Negative reinforcement exists. Positive reinforcement exists. What's interesting is that all the studies show that negative reinforcement is actually imprints more than positive. And so years ago, when I was in my 20s, I was a teacher and a coach, and I went to this wonderful talk about, how to motivate kids and coaching clinic. And there were like, there's college football coaches there. There's one college football coach who didn't have arms beyond his elbows. This was one of the best speakers I ever heard. He was incredible. He was talking about potential and how potential is endless. There's no limit to potential. Just that imprinted on me. But one thing I walked away with, which was very useful, was the idea that every kid needs 8 positive reinforcing statements in order to hear the constructive criticism in one negative statement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you don't have that ratio of 8 to 1, and you can think of this in terms of in your own mind, if you don't have that ratio, what happens?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're not going to hear the constructive criticism. They're going to hear the shame. They're going to feel the shame. They're going to recoil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's the same thing here. You have the pint of ice cream. Now, your ability to then get back to where you were is dependent upon the way you respond to falling back. If you respond with shame and negativity, it's going to actually reinforce it. You're going to recoil back. Okay? If you respond with acceptance, you open up the space to then make a new choice, right? And reinforce essentially the pathways, the path that you had been working on to get out of it.
Sure.
But that 20% is not easy.
No.
Right? And it actually requires a shift in the person's relationship with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Or their relationship with their higher power, which is also sort of within themselves. I can help. The work we do here can help quite a bit. But if you don't have that piece, quite honestly, in my opinion, it's better if you just stop at the 80%. It's not worth the vacillation and the suffering involved in that. Just stop at the 80%.
Well, it sounds like, so acupuncture can help you put you into that baseline state where progress can continue to happen. But then what do I do? What does the person do with the, lifting the other side of the box? You can only lift one side. I have to lift one side.
You have to give your allegiance to something greater than yourself. So that might be our agreed upon program here. Like, you're going to show up once a week. You're going to show up twice a week. It might be also in that agreed upon program for 15 minutes in the morning, right? When you get out of bed, you're going to do some yoga. You're going to stretch your body, right? Or before you go to bed, you're going to take a bath. You're going to do things that actually nourish in some way, and you're going to change habits so that you promote circulation and reduce inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So stress, including self-talk, creates constriction and inflammation. So that's a part of the process. You can't remain the same self in your own mind, right? With the same self-talk and the same reactions to stimuli. You can't remain that and have a different experience. It's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take the whole thing. There's no separation between body, chemistry, physiology, emotions, spiritual, mental. It's one gestalt. If you want to move to a different experience of being, the whole thing has to move.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? When I was at Boston University, I was in the Zen Buddhist club there, which was very hard for me because I've always had very tight hips. I was a rugby player at BU, and I was fast, and one reason I was fast was because my hip flexors were so tight. and so I had to go and I had to sit sometimes for an hour, right? And I couldn't sit cross-legged, so I had to put the pillow between my legs and sit on my knees. But even that, right? And so my body wasn't comfortable, and I was dealing with developing a new relationship to the mind substance. And the teacher was fairly harsh, which is not unusual for the Zen lineage. And she'd give a Dharma talk after the meditation. And there was this one question, or koan, which are these questions that have no rational answers, but are supposed to open your mind up to the underlying reality. So the question was, how does a cow jump through a window but get its tail stuck?
Okay.
How?
Tail must be tied, or it gets caught in the windowsill.
See, isn't that funny how your mind is like, oh, hold on a second, let me get to reductionism and materialism, and try and answer an esoteric question with that.
Sure.
Right? It doesn't work. What they're trying to do is illuminate you to this very thing. When you're trying to change your entire experience of being in the world, if your mind doesn't change the way it relates to experience, you'll get stuck. You can get your body as healthy as you want. You can go to church every day, you can meditate every day, you can go to temple every day, you can do your daily prayers on your mat every day, you can do yoga every single day. But if the mind isn't willing to let go of control, you're going to get stuck.
I find myself, I'm almost desperately willing to change and let go, but am aware of how stuck and rooted the insecurity and all the other things are.
Okay, but even that, right? Who's generating the insecurity?
I am.
Right? So we've been taught, and I'm not saying that this is wrong, right? Like, we have to work with what we got, right? We have to realize that we are fully responsible for our experience. And until you realize that you're fully responsible for your experience, well, then people always give the example, well, then why do kids get cancer? We're trying to implement the most useful approach to the life experience. In the way life is there's always going to be a ghost in the machine. There's always going to be something that is beyond your control. That's just what it is. But if you have the mindset that you're responsible, then you start asking yourself questions. And the question is, what is this insecurity? How is it being generated? How is it being reinforced? And then the really quintessential question is, how am I doing it? You don't want to ask yourself, how do I undo it? You have to figure out first how it is that you're doing it, right? You have to find complete acceptance for it, right? The subconscious is real. It means it's below the level of consciousness. The mind can't understand it, but the subconscious can be communicated with through feeling, right? So do you feel the insecurity or do you reject it?
Both. I feel it.
So,
And then I reject the feeling.
so that rejecting of the feeling is a rejection of responsibility for it. It's a rejection of acceptance that you're the one who's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Now our mind wants to say, well, then why am I doing that? So, come on.
I understand why. Like,
What?
I see the history, I see the pattern, I see the things that have led me to this moment.
The world that we live in is an unstable place, right? It's not, I would say, something that is a not, the insecurity makes sense. Okay? The question is, are you willing to continue to live with it? Are you willing to walk in the face of the instability because you're tired of suffering?
Yes.
See, for me, that's how it happened with me. I'm just tired of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That person wronged me. I mean, really wronged me. That person stole from me. That person betrayed me. I hurt myself physically here. I broke my nose twice in a rugby game. Like, I don't want to let go of these things. Those are my realities.
Mm-hmm.
But God, I hate suffering. I mean, maybe I'm just a desperately weak human being, but I hate suffering.
Yeah.
So my allegiance is to the absence of suffering. Well, I don't have any touchstone for that. Well, if your allegiance is to something that you can't see,
Mm-hmm.
and you have no evidence for, but you know exists, there's a deep knowing that it exists.
Yeah.
The absence of suffering. I have a deep knowing that that exists. Well, how do I obtain that?
Yeah.
Well, I go within myself and I find a way. And if I don't know how, then I ask for help. And then if I ask for help with people, and this has happened many times, that I want to, it's like, for years I was in couples therapy. Well, every therapist I was in couples therapy with was not in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of them had been divorced twice, and he was giving us, I mean, wonderful information, like information that I hold close to my heart and has really helped me in my life, but sure didn't help me with the relationship. It helped me with my relationship with myself.
Sure.
Right? So you have to see someone that, I mean, they don't have to be enlightened. I don't even know if anyone is enlightened, but they have to be someone who's honest and has sort of walked the walk to some degree, right? It's not just throwing products and services at you. If you want to ask for help. And a lot of people are jumping towards psychedelics now because they give you the absence. That's what psychedelics do. Yeah. Right? They give you the absence of, oh, I get to experience attention with the absence of the threat response. And isn't the world wondrous? Right? So it gives you kind of this window, but it doesn't change anything. I mean, I know lots of people are saying that it changes things. I think what it does, if it changes things, the way it changes things, in my opinion, is it gives people hope.
Yeah, well, if you experience it, then you know it's possible, and
Yes.
then that you have something to move towards.
Correct.
Yeah.
But in my experience, and working with a lot of folks, especially on the West Coast, who were doing deep dives into this stuff, it's really easy to go into a state of delusion over it.
Well, it also could become a crutch that you're not actually doing the work.
It's spiritual bypass.
Right.
Right. And so, there's a disconnect between the image in your own head of who and what you are and what you're doing, what your behavior is and what you're experiencing, and the reality. And that can be really dangerous. Lives fall apart because of that. But we got off track a little bit. So yes, you have to be willing to go to a place that you know is there, but you don't know how to create. Like the absence of suffering. I know the absence of suffering exists. I've experienced the absence of suffering. I think everybody has experienced the absence of suffering without alcohol or whatever.
Sure.
Right? You've had moments. You've had at least a moment. So you know it exists. Then the only question is like, well, why is that not more a part of my experience? And if you take responsibility, you go through and you can start untying the knots, right? And you can start looking at, how it is that you're nourishing yourself. Are you nourishing yourself with boxed meat that has been laden with ammonia that is then killing your microbiome when you eat it? And so you're inadvertently creating suffering. Are you eating conventional farmed foods that have been sprayed with pesticides and herbicides that are affecting your hormones and making perforations in your gut because they're poisonous, right? What are the things that you're doing outwardly, inadvertently, that are creating suffering? And you start to refine. And perfection doesn't exist. We're human. We're always going to do something that's creating some sort of suffering, but you refine and you refine and you refine, and then there's less and there's less, and then the events that happen in life, you have less of a threat response to, you have less of a stress response to, right? And then when you have less of a stress response to it, there's less of an impact on the function of the body, right? And this is, in my experience and in my opinion, this is the best that we can aim for in the reality that we're in.
But these are all the outwardly things that we can control or, influence the progress. But what if it's the inward stuff that is the poison, like the thoughts, the thought patterns?
So, Molly, you're my friend, and every time we hang out, you say these very subversive, passive-aggressive things to me that are meant to shame me and elevate
You're speaking
you.
Hypothetically. or is this a moment?
And elevate you, right? And because I'm so in that experience that, or, in different relationships in my life, probably in early life, there's a comfort level there for me, right? And so I keep, scheduling time to be with you and give you my attention, and I give you my attention over and over again. So it's constantly reinforcing this, I'm just not good enough, and, I should be ashamed, and, oh, she's right? Now, what if I decide to stop interacting with you? Right? I stop giving you my attention. It's the exact same thing with your thoughts. You have to realize that anything that you are aware of is not you. You are the awareness.
Yes.
Everything else is not you. So your experience, to a large degree, I would not say entirely, but to a large degree, your experience is determined by what you put your awareness or your attention on, which it's hard because I have trouble with that language, because you are awareness, so you're putting you on that, right? So every time you pay attention to those insecure thoughts, right, all you do is you reinforce them.
It's compounded.
So you have to get some discipline with attention, right? And you have this, you're able to drive.
Yeah.
If you're able to drive, you can discipline your attention. You're just choosing to do it there, and you're not choosing to do it here.
I feel like there's the 80-20% rule applies there too. Like,
Well,
I got 80% there, and then I came up against the 20%, and then it got super hard, and now I'm back.
Well, once you get past that 80%, it gets very existential.
Yeah.
Which is tough. Because the gripping and the holding and the negative self-talk actually give some sort of stable structure, right? People are probably not going to like this analogy, but I've used it before, and I think it's actually really a good one, which is the Twin Towers. Their structure was...
Lord of the Rings? Oh, the other. Twin Towers, Lord of the
Not
Rings.
the two towers.
That's my, oh God, baseline. Okay, you're talking about 9/11.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. The World
Gotcha.
Trade Center, Twin Towers, right? The physics of that.
Uh-huh.
They had their steel supports on the outside,
Sure.
right? And that gave a sense of stability to the inside.
Mm-hmm.
But when it was hit with a force, it actually was a false sense of stability.
Yeah.
Okay? It's the same thing. So the tension, the constriction, the gripping that comes with the threat response, and the narrative that comes with the threat response is a false sense of security. But what it does is it gives you something to hold on to in this world where nothing is fully stable. Everything is in flux, right? Well, and you say, well, this wood is here every day. Come on, right? Like the human world is constantly in flux, where our body is changing every second. 1 million cells die, 1 million cells are made. You know, our body, which we think is solid, is actually not solid. It's in process. And that process can shift at any moment if you change the conditions. And it's the same thing with life. And the conditions change constantly. The biggest thing is the weather.
Yeah.
But they change socially. Who do I trust?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's such a huge thing right now with, so many voices out there that are trying to manipulate everybody else to believe their narrative, which they're incentivized to push. Who do I believe? These institutional, industrial structures that as a child we sort of trusted, our food supply, our medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, right? These large things, they're incentivized in such a way that, for instance, the sick care industry, because it's a sick care industry, it's not a healthcare industry, it's incentivized to keep you sick and alive. That's the best consumer. And no matter how good the intent is of the person working within the system, that's the incentive in the system. So that's what's going to happen.
The media is incentivized to keep you afraid, so you come back.
The media is incentivized to keep eyeballs, right? And the cheapest way to do that is to keep you in two states. Actually, the ideal is to keep you vacillating between two states, even three, actually. Fight, flight, and freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they can keep you vacillating between being angry, embittered, righteous, and desperately afraid, and also make you feel like you have no power in the world, so you're also depressed.
Yeah.
Oh, your eyeballs are locked.
But we digress. So what do you, I keep having this question, like, what do you do? Like, and the answer just seems to be just have the intent, be consistent with showing up with the willingness to change, almost have grace and patience.
So, well, hold on a second. So how do you get grace? So this is, I mean, this is really near and dear to my heart, because God knows you've touched on my internal struggle. So grace is the absence of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say, like, I know the absence of suffering exists, I know that grace exists,
Mm-hmm.
right? But grace is a state of faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? But to get there, unless you're born under the right star, or you have some sort of like awakening or something like that, to get there really is this process of refining within yourself everything that you are doing, either intentionally or unintentionally, in order to create suffering. And then to get to the outcome you desire, you have to let go.
Okay.
Right? You have to allow space for grace.
So it's just the introspection.
Contemplation. Contemplation is wonderful.
The presence.
Introspection, what data you're looking at?
Yeah.
How do you know if it's real? We're constantly fooling ourselves, both on the micro level and the macro level. We're constantly fooling ourselves. And we're even fooling ourselves using the scientific method. How do we know it's real? The proof is in the pudding. When somebody comes to me and they're not able to walk, right? And they leave the treatment room walking, that's real.
Yeah.
If they come to me and they're like, oh, and I say, oh, it's what we're going to do is going to work. It's going to work. And then they get off the table and they're not walking. And I say to them, it's working. I'm lying.
Yeah.
The proof is in the pudding. So take note of your experience, because that's where the reality actually is. Right? And so much of experience can't be quantified. The quality of your experience, right? That's the proof.
So in your words, what do you do? To continue that psycho-spiritual 20%?
You have to catch yourself constantly. Anytime you catch yourself in that negative self-talk,
mm-hmm.
right? You have to catch yourself, and you have to
Remind
do what the
yourself of faith.
alcoholic does, because you're addicted, right? You're addicted to that self-talk. It's an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And you live in an environment which is constantly trying to weaponize our tendency to become addicted, right? If we can become addicted to something, we'll find a way to weaponize that in the marketplace. We will. Okay? Which I'm fine with, right? This is part of the human experience.
Yeah.
You still have the choice. You don't have to get hooked. You don't have to get hooked by your own thought. And how do you not get hooked? That comes up in your head, and I mean, this is what the alcoholic does. Give it over to the higher power.
Choose again.
Again and again and again and again. I can't manage this. I can't.
Ooh, even the sense of relief I just got.
I can't manage this.
Mm-hmm.
I can't handle this burden. I can't. I know I can't. I've tried 1,000, 100,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000, 1,000,000,000,000 times. I can't manage it. I have to give it over to God. I have to give it over to my higher power. I have to give it over to something that can manage it. You have to acknowledge that there are things greater than you. Are you the one that created this experience? You're not. So there has to be something, whether it's the experience itself or something outside the experience. I really don't care. I just care about what's useful.
Sure.
Right? But I didn't create this experience. Am I creating my experience, I am a co-creator with my experience. So I need to take responsibility for what it is that I'm doing.
Sure.
Right? So whatever, whether it is, whether we anthropomorphize this and we call it God and we picture it in human form, or we are a naturalist and we are an expression of nature and it's nature itself, or I don't care. But you give it over to that because that's the one that's capable of managing what's unmanageable for you. Turn it over.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hope this conversation has been as beneficial for you as it's been for me, and I think it's very fascinating, especially in the context of health and healing, by body, mind, and spirit. Like you're saying, we are all one. It is all one.
It's all one unit.
It's all one unit, and being able to treat all of it and finding people like you or other, guides to be able to facilitate this total experience healing is so great.
A return to, what I would say is a return to our inheritance.
Yeah.
Right, and moving away from the weave that we've woven, that is really at its heart a threat response.
Well, thank you, Dr. Joe.
You're welcome.